Great, thank you very much, Esther, and thanks, Ronan and Katarina, for being here with us. Thanks for the wonderful presentation, Ronan. Katarina, I obviously don't expect you to go on for another 40 minutes and give us a presentation about Sweden, but I'm sure you do have reflections listening to Ronan. And you would have noticed, as everyone else in the audience as well, that on those international rankings that he was showing, Sweden is always featured somewhere near the top. So it would be really interesting to just get a few thoughts from you on how that position was achieved in your country.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much. And it's so wonderful. This is a highlight of the year. It's the third year I'm participating in this International Women's event by Egyenlítő. And I just wish we would all be in that room like last year and 2 years ago. But it's still wonderful to be together here and see all these brilliant women and so much knowledge, experience, also some brilliant men for sure. And I would, of course, I would love to, I could talk about the Swedish opportunity development, I guess, for 80 minutes or 120 minutes, but I promise not to plague you with that. But I mean, I think, yes, it is true that, I mean, we look at all these rankings and undoubtedly we are a champion when it comes to gender equality rights. And I mean, my usual kind of answer when I get that question, so how did we get there? I mean, it is really the story, I think, of the Sved Astal. You know, there is not a silver bullet or one panacea that can fix this thing. And I think that was also obvious from Ronan's excellent presentation, that there are multiple factors. I mean, in the case of Sweden, of course, there were you know, economic changes as well, which also, so to say, gave the possibility for women to enter the labor market. We had extremely important legislation, and legislation is, of course, not only legislation on paper, it's also implementing laws when it comes to anti-discrimination and so forth. Of course, there was political will, political leadership for sure. I mean, there has to be, as we heard also from our excellent discussions with the CEOs and on the corporate sector, there has to be buy-in from the highest level. But then we had so many other processes. I mean, not just top down. I mean, we definitely had an extremely strong civil society, a movement in terms of demanding change, in terms of changing norms, ingrained gender stereotypes and so forth. We had a lot of research. I want to stress, you know, the academic side here also. You need to study these things. It's a science, right? And there are tons of evidence out there. So I think, I mean, in combination, this has been, you know, important reforms for sure when it comes to, let's get back to that, about the social insurance system that enables men and women to both have a family and work, have been absolutely fundamental to be able to realize some of this. So the short answer, a Sved Astal of many, many different things working together.
As you were outlining how society changed in Ireland, Ronan, I couldn't help but wonder whether there was also a backlash against this change, this shift in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think.
Did you experience anything like that? If yes, how did it manifest and how did the country deal with it?
Yeah, so I think, historically, I mean, on these very divisive issues, such as reproductive rights or on same-sex marriage or marriage equality, on divorce even, and these sort of issues that are so important for opening up society and making it more progressive, and also important for gender equality. We had decades of very divisive discussions, and as I said, it was very much influenced by the influence of the church and what the bishops were saying at the time. And the reality was that politics at the time and politicians at the time were very much swayed by what the church was doing and saying. And I think that's also reflected in the fact that because most people were going to mass every week in that generation, that politicians were reflecting what they were hearing on the ground, and those people were hearing the more conservative messaging from the church. So when the change did come and came quite quickly, then in the end, in the last decade, to some extent the pushback wasn't as big as people had feared. Yes, the church was against marriage equality. Yes, the church was against the legalization of abortion. But I think at that stage, because of the decades of the decade before of scandals, they really lost a lot of moral authority, and I think even themselves, they felt that they weren't in a very strong position to be campaigning against these issues. So even though they sent out their messaging about what they think how people should vote, they weren't very active in the campaign, and some of their think tanks decided not to be active in campaigns because it just wasn't. They just felt the mood of the country that it wasn't going to go to work. And I think the other factor, I think, that helped in making sure that there wasn't such a huge backlash was that there was a very high level of political consensus around these issues. So even though there might be some political voices on the fringes that were very unhappy with this, and they would protest and they would use social media for pushing out their messaging, the vast majority of the politicians in the parliament, I think nearly even all of them, with the exception of one or two, knew that this was a time for change. And I mean, break for instance, the abortion referendum in 2018, a big turning point in that campaign, when the leader of Fianna Fáil, which has been a dominant force in Irish politics since our independence, and one of the main centre-right parties or centre parties, but would have been seen as quite socially conservative, their leader came in and said very clearly that he was voting yes. And he was voting yes because we couldn't go on doing this to the help of women in Ireland and exporting our problems to other countries. I mean, so I think that really helped in making sure that there wasn't such a big resistance in the country. I think, and the whole process of deliberative democracy, the whole process of the Constitutional Convention of the Citizen Assembly, tried to build that consensus so that there wasn't this really toxic debate and over-politicization of the issues when it came to the actual referendum themselves, compared to what we had in the 70s and 80s.
And in the case of Sweden, Katarina, was there a backlash in your country?
I mean, I don't know if I want to use the word backlash. I mean, if you look at the indicators, they have, you know, when it comes to, for example, representation, it is very stable. Excuse me for that, people send me emails. I would say, I mean, of course, in any, you know, changing society, change is something that can threaten and be challenging, finding new identities. And always, I mean, shifting power structures will always cause some resistance, let's put it this way. And I think, I mean, we have a very dynamic discussion going on constantly. Somebody was talking, we talked about quotas here earlier. I thought it was a very interesting moment, which also shows that, you know, how this could work when we, for example, when it comes to representation in the mid-90s, we had quite a breakthrough when it comes to female representation in the parliament. The short story was that a lot of people were quite fed up with the slow progress. They asked, where are the women in the mid-90s? And there was a very strong NGO civil society movement that more or less threatened that if, you know, they wouldn't see greater progress. Is it only me hearing a lot of echo, or is that unfortunate for everybody? I'm sorry about that. I have
there is some echo, but I think we can understand you. So go
okay. On. I will raise my voice, as I usually try to do. What we had was simply, there was a movement who formulated a demand and said that if the traditional parties would not step up when it came to female representation, they would form a new party. So it was a kind of, you know, threat hanging over, so to say, the parties. What it led to was that some of the major parties actually did this, because they introduced on the party list, you had every second place was a woman, which also resulted in a big change when it came to representation. So what they did was actually de facto introducing a quota. Even if it wasn't a legal quota, it was a de facto quota. And as everywhere, and as we know, there is a very intense discussion always about quotas, and there are criticisms about that. No, introducing a quota would somehow be counterproductive, because you would substitute competent people with less competent people. And the interesting part of this was that it also it was applicable for this reform for the party list. After that, some researchers actually evaluated this reform, looking into the facts. So what actually happened when this de facto quota was introduced? And they came to the conclusion that the levels of the competence level of men increased, and the competence level of women either stayed the same or increased. So to put it a bit bluntly, one can say that this de facto quota resulted in that, competent women replaced mediocre men. So this is for the discussion to continue debating. So I would say there is a discussion, but it's also very important to go back and look at the academic scientific evidence that can refute some misconceptions.
Speaking of men, I guess when we're thinking about this issue, it isn't just enough to look at the societal attitudes and perceptions of women in the workforce or in leadership positions. It's also important to look at how society perceives and accepts men who might be staying at home for a few years to look after that family, to take care of children and so on. So how are you doing on this in Ireland, Roland, and how did that change come about?
Yeah, I think that change is still underway. I think it's, while there's sort of been lots of change in Ireland on marriage equality, for instance, and other issues, maybe on gender equality, the change hasn't been as profound as in other areas, even though we, relatively speaking, on global indexes, we do quite well, similar to Sweden. But I think in the area of, I think as Katarina was talking about there, I think the big key on these issues is to get over this kind of conversation that there's going to have to be winners and losers. So if you have gender equality and more women in the workplace and more women getting promoted and more women getting into positions of influence, it means that men have to lose. And I think that's something it's an attitudinal and cultural thing in Ireland that we still have to deal with. And I think it is changing, and it's changing because of lots of factors. It's changing because of modern technology. And even with COVID now, we see a situation where more men are working from home because they can work from home and because of technology, and that means they're taking more responsibility for work at home and for looking after children and care at the home and so forth. But I still think there's other areas where we do need to improve and get over this sort of attitude that is going to be winners and losers, or that somehow my career is going to be affected by helping situation for women. And I think that has to change from the top down, but also from the bottom up. From the top down, what the government is trying to do is introduce, for instance, introduce paternity leave for the first time in Ireland. So it's not very much, but at least Irish fathers now have 2 weeks paternity leave, paid paternity leave. But also they've introduced parental leave, which means that any parent can take over the course of, at the moment, a year, up to 5 weeks off work to look after the family. So that's for women and men. And then they've actually now extended that to be able to take those 5 weeks for over 2 years. I think they found from lessons was that if it's only over a year, less men are taking it because they can't get the time at work or work pressures or whatever it might be. But if they spread it over two years, they will more likely to take that parental leave. So I think it's linked into a lot of different issues like work-life balance and the issues of sort of presentism in Ireland, which is a kind of culture of people have to stay and work late. So changing those attitudes then has to come from the bottom up, and those attitudes and change have to come from the leadership in companies, but also in the civil service and public service, to say that you shouldn't be in the office past this time. You need to spend more time with your family. You need to get the work-life balance correct. And that's done through training, it's done through incentives and so forth. So I think that attitudinal and cultural change is underway in Ireland, and still has a bit of a way to travel. And as Katarina said, it's linked to legislation, it's linked to social welfare systems, and that all has to be worked through in the next 5 to 10 years.
And I guess it's not only about the systems, although that's an integral part, it's also about just the attitude of how people are viewed, seen, or what kind of social feedback they get from their circle of friends or the people at work. How is that concerning fathers stepping up in Sweden, Katarina?
Well, I mean, I think it's very important to once again, I mean, kind of reiterate that you have norms changing, and you have legislation, and you have social security systems. And I think, I mean, in Sweden, all of this has been changing and it's in place. We're not there yet. I mean, I think we should, if we concentrate on this absolutely central theme, which has to do with, having a work-life balance, being able to work and have a family at most of the time, which is, what we're taught that, that's most of the people would like that. There are absolutely people who don't want to work and people who don't want to have a family, but the vast majority would like that. And I think that we cannot, we will never be able to solve the equation of having a life consisting of, so to say, the paid jobs and then the unpaid jobs. And when it comes to the unpaid jobs, we can simply say that, well, you can have it all, but only if there is gender equality. So of course, I mean, you will run into, you can ultimately, encourage and empower women to step up, to do their careers and so forth. But if you don't address the issue of the unpaid work, Adina was referring it to the second shift, as we all know, then this is, it's not going to change fundamentally. And in order to do that, I think I very much agree with you, Ronan, that of course it should not only be portrayed as a power struggle. I think it's important to talk about power structures as well. But of course, I would very much argue that, getting away from a very masculinity ideal is definitely a win-win for any society. I mean, in Sweden, we solved it in the way that we kind of designed our social security systems. We have parental leave. 3 months are earmarked for one parent, which in essence is, of course, targeted towards men. And this has been a way to nudge, society by introducing these structures to encourage more men to make use of this. It's happening, but we're not there yet. I mean, also in Sweden, around a third of this paternity leave is taken by men and 2/3 of women. So there is still a long way to go.
Having you with us, Katarina, today is not just wonderful because you're the representative of a very progressive society when it comes to gender equity, but also because you have a unique perspective when it comes to our country, Hungary, partly for personal reasons and because you've been here for a while now working at the Swedish Embassy. So how do you see us and how do you see the difference?
Yeah, being a Hungarian-Swedish cocktail, I hope that I am allowed to make some observations. I think, it's linking to the issues that we already touched upon. I mean, of course, let's go back to that excellent presentation in the beginning of the program, the value survey, where we very clearly, of course, could see that Hungary and Sweden were on, so to say, the extreme sides when it comes to, the prime role for a woman, where the absolute vast majority in Sweden would say that it is not as a mother and a caregiver. It's much broader than that. And I think we can also see, I like to go back to the numbers. I'm not afraid of statistics. I think it's very useful. Of course, when it comes to labor participation, it's just a fact that women are not working as much as in Sweden. We have the highest labor participation, around 80%. And of course, I see that. I mean, in my home country, so to say, everybody works. People want to work. They don't really have a choice, I would say, because you need to work. You need to have 2 incomes. And it also means exactly what we discussed already, the other side of the coin, that there has to be gender equality when it comes to the unpaid jobs. And of course, I see a stronger pattern here that women are taking the lion's share, the absolute biggest responsibility for the household, for bringing up children, caretakers of elderly, and so on. I think that is, of course, one of the key issues. That's why we would love to work on this together with the Egyenlítő, as Edina was saying in the beginning here, together with the Nordic embassies, to address exactly that and to present some Nordic models when it comes to getting it all, but conditioned on gender equality. I would say, other things that I noticed, of course, representation. I represent a government that is, 50, I think even actually more women than men these days. We have a feministic foreign policy. We have a feminist government. Speaking about the F word, perhaps, I mean, for me, it's completely uncontroversial to say that I'm a feminist. I think everybody I know is a feminist, and being, of course, very aware of the, this concept being contaminated in a way during the communist time. I think it's a pity that this is a concept that sometimes people can shy away from, because as I always say, I have a very simple definition of being a feminist. Feminist is looking at the world, wanting gender equality because it's both right and it's a smart thing, and seeing that this is not the case, which you can just open any report anywhere to realize that there is a gap. There is a huge gap. And we know from the World Bank survey that it would take 108 years for us to close that gap. And the third thing, I want to do something about it. And that's basically my definition of being a feminist. It's somewhat more problematic to express here. I mean, the final thing would be, of course, in Sweden we have gender studies. It's science. It's part of almost every university. This is not the case here in Hungary.
Ronan, what's your take on the situation in Hungary?
Well, I've been here less than 2 years now, since I took up my post in summer 2019, and I mean, I think so. I probably don't have as much insight and knowledge as Katarina does in terms of the specific area of gender equality in Hungary, but I think there's some general trends that I've sort of noticed that I think is going to have an impact in this area, or is having an impact in this area, and maybe why Hungary, compared to other countries in the European Union, is not doing as well in areas such as representation or labour participation. But I mean, one factor I think is, and I think it's undeniable, is that politics in Hungary has become very polarised, and that does make it more challenging, because if you look at the example of Ireland, where we had this deliberative democracy experience over the last 10 years, where we had a citizens' assembly and a constitutional convention, that was done through political consensus. It's done through politicians getting together and parties getting together and saying, we need change in Ireland and we should do it in a consensual way, through these mechanisms which involve citizens in the conversation. So it's that bottom-up approach, I think, is something that maybe is lacking here in Hungary that could have an impact. And I think more generally as well, and something that we've looked at it from Ireland's point of view as well, is trying to empower and give this space to civil society organisations that are so crucial, and in Sweden's case it's the same, and same in Ireland's case, are so crucial for advocating for these issues and pushing for change. And I think the reality here in Hungary is that unfortunately there isn't that level of cooperation between, not that CSOs have to agree with everything the government does, of course they're there to keep the government accountable, but as well as other things, but there isn't that level of wanting to work together between government and civil society organisations, and I mean, like Sweden, we're part of the like-minded group on rule of law and the European Union. We actively participate in these discussions in Brussels, and the reality is, based on Commission assessments and so forth, is that the space for civil society in Hungary is narrowing. So I think those couple of factors, where if you want to have a real impact on changing people's attitudes, and having a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down approach, is to have an opportunity for politicians to show leadership by working together, but also then to work together with civil society organisations. So there are two sort of ways where Ireland has tried to lead the way and has really had a really positive impact on the changes that underwent in Ireland, and maybe that's something that Hungary needs to look at in the future as well.
Katarina, you referred to a feminist foreign policy just now, which is a term that probably most of us on this call have not heard before. What is a feminist foreign policy, and how is that manifesting both within your embassies and in the terms of Sweden trying to spread these values around the world?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yes, feminist foreign policy is something that we have been, I mean, the label was coined in 2014. I would perhaps argue that in essence that we have been, we had a feminist foreign policy before. I'm very happy to say and also to share with you that we're not alone with this, using this slogan, so to say. Several other countries have now followed suit, and just the other day there was actually a meeting between ministers from countries who now also claim they pursue a feminist foreign policy. I mean, having a feminist foreign policy is basically, I mean, putting on your gender glasses constantly in absolutely everything. So in all the policies that we pursue, if it's trade or it's aid or it's building, politics whatsoever, we always ask, I mean, first of all, where are the women? I mean, that's a question which is, you know, at the very, very top. And you ask about the embassy, how this kind of trickles down into the everyday life of a Swedish embassy now these days. That's a fundamental issue. Where are the women? We don't participate in what we call the manuals, and we simply don't take an answer to a question to say there are no women, because it's not true, because there are women. We're actually a majority in the world. You just have to go out.
I'm sorry, Katarina, for interrupting you, but does this mean that you walk into a room where, does this mean that you walk into a room where you're meant to have a meeting concerning a trade issue, for instance, and the person from the Swedish embassy would insist on seeing the women involved before you go any further discussing the matter of hand? You say, you would actually say, I mean, we're not talking to a panel of men, where are your women? And does it come down to practicals like that? How
I think yeah, I mean, it definitely comes down to, I mean, if you are part of organizing an event, I mean, this is a question that comes up very, very early, to say that, you know, we cannot have a conference or a seminar where only men are talking, as an example. So very practically. But when it comes to the policy issues, I mean, it's about, once again, those gender glasses always being present, asking the questions. How is this going to impact women? If you look at the budget, if you look at some kind of project that's being implemented, is this going to have a different impact on women and men? In order to answer that question, you, for example, need a lot of disaggregated data. So you don't just say people think this or people do that, but you actually ask, so what about women and what about men? So it's kind of a lens, a kind of a prism that you regard the world, and you use that. I mean, on the very, very top level, when you're talking about global policies, as well as in your operational daily life, when you are, as an example, organizing something. That's a short answer.
Would you, Ronan, would you describe Irish foreign policy as feminist foreign policy? What's Ireland doing with the values?
Yeah, so I think what we have is a values-based foreign policy, so not dissimilar to Sweden. And of course, as part of those values is gender equality. We see everything through the prism of human rights and fundamental values, and we consider gender equality to be a human right and a fundamental value. So that then informs everything, how we approach things. And similar to Sweden, I mean, on the issue, say, for instance, of panels, I mean, we would always try and avoid a situation where we have only male panels for any sort of event that we do, either by as an embassy or as a foreign ministry, or more generally. And I think the other ways that it's manifesting itself is in two main ways. One is in the area of women, peace and security, which is a big priority for Ireland. We've had the experience of the peace process on the island of Ireland and the peace agreement in 1998. And as I said in my presentation, a big part of that was what's called the Women's Coalition. And it was a real effort by a movement, but also by the other participants to make sure that women's voices were heard in those negotiations. And we then use that as an example to demonstrate in other areas of the world that when it comes to peace negotiations or peace agreements or negotiations, gender and anything, you need to have involvement of women, because the evidence shows that if you have the involvement of women, the outcomes are far more inclusive and far more sustainable into the future. So that's one area. And then the other area, as Katarina talked about as well, is our overseas development assistance, where gender is mainstreamed into everything we do. So every project we look to fund, look from the gender perspective, see what the impact will be on women and girls. And we have a particular priority in relation to education of women and girls. So a lot of our funding, or some of our funding, goes into Africa in particular, is focused on education for women and girls. So they're the kind of two main ways. And as I said, in the next couple of years, we're members of the UN Security Council for 2021, 2022, and we want to be there to be seen as representing countries that have that values-based approach to foreign policy, that want to prioritize gender equality. So anything we do and the approach we take and everything, whether it's on peace and security in terms of what's going on, for instance, in Ethiopia or Syria, we want to make sure there's a gender angle in that, but also in relation to human rights issues and development issues.
Just to add on a little bit, Antónia, and to Ronan, I think repeating that, you know, I mean, for us, it's important to stress that gender equality in itself is, of course, a goal, because it's a human right and it's enshrined in international law. But gender equality is also a prerequisite, a condition to achieve all these other goals. I mean, we won't have sustainability. We won't have sustainable peace. We won't have an innovative society as well without gender equality. So you can regard it as a goal in itself, right-based, and also in one way a more instrumentalized view on it to be a component that has to be present in all these other aspirations that we are pursuing.
Well, thank you to both of you for describing the incredibly important role that governments have, not just within their own respective countries, but also around the world in terms of spreading these values. But most of this call or in this conference today, I think, work in the corporate sector. And multinational companies clearly also have a key role in shaping societal attitudes around the world. And Ronan, you have already touched on this a little bit in your presentation as well. How do you see this responsibility, and how do you see the specific tasks in a country like ours for the corporate multinational sector, Katarina?
Well, I mean, I think it's been excellently kind of illustrated during this morning's discussion that, you know, multinational companies, they can be front runners, right? I mean, they have the possibility to, I mean, we heard about all these initiatives in terms of promoting female leaders, about role models, about buy-ins, about, you know, forming special programs, about enabling women to get back after their maternity leave and so on, encouraging men to use paternity leave. This is an excellent, I think, the whole question about the life and work balance to combine, as I was saying, the paid job and the unpaid jobs. It's something where multinationals can become role models as companies as well by pursuing these policies. They can enable women to have flexible working hours. They can enable men to use their paternity leave. They have a flexibility here, and that's also a way that they can brand themselves to become, you know, attractive employers who are going to foster, you know, growth and cost cutting and so forth, because there's also tons of evidence, as everybody in this room knows, about the so to say, the prosperity, the profitability of a diverse workforce. So I think definitely they can become front runners.
Thank you very much for that. So Ronan, what's your take on what Hungarian companies, multinationals and others specifically, could do all of this?
Yeah, no, I think fundamentally is leadership. You know, so I think it's incumbent on the public sector, but also the private sector, and particularly the big players in the private sector that have the resources to show leadership in these areas. So it's not just means implementing internally measures that will encourage greater gender equality, more work-life balance, maternity leave, recognizing the role of women and men at home, and the time to do that. But I think it's also showing that, it's demonstrating that to the public through communications as well. So I think to some extent, the corporate and the multinationals probably have more resources in this respect, have a responsibility then to work with the public sector as well, which have to show leadership. So if it's good enough for the private sector, it needs to be good enough for the public sector. And actually, the public sector should be the first movers almost on all these issues. But then the private sector should also be taking a leadership role and working together really to make sure that we do have these ideals, but also the practices in place to make sure that we can achieve what we're trying to achieve, and to do it in a way that the multinationals and companies are not afraid to talk about it. I mean, they need to get out to the public and do communications around it and say, this is what our company values, these are the values of our company, and this is how we're implementing it in our company, and we want to tell people about it in terms of best practice. And so hopefully others will take the lead from us.
And how about the rest of us, Katarina? Those who are not in government, not in the driving seat of corporate entities, but want to do our part?
I think you can do a lot. I mean, like you are doing, and we are doing here, sitting here today and talking about these issues. I think there are a few things. I sometimes thought about that. There could be kind of the gospel, the 10 commandments of how to support each other in order to catalyze gender equality. And I would have a few on the top of my mind there. I mean, first of all, once again, that support each other, that women support each other. You all remember this wonderful quote of Madeleine Albright, the secretary, who said that there is a special place in hell for women who don't support each other. I very much believe in that. These kind of platforms, communities like yours are an excellent way of doing that. I think women need to take space, the space that they deserve. And sometimes women also need to tell men to back off. I think that's the only way also to get that space and not to blame women for not being adamant enough, but also encourage them to ask men to take a step back. I think we can always bring up female representation. We talked about it earlier. The question, where are the women, should be there in any endeavor, in any project, in anything you're pursuing. And I think that what I was trying to describe when it comes to the feministic foreign policy, to put on your gender glasses, to ask these questions every time that you're involved in a policy discussion or a budget or a program whatsoever, and say, okay, how is this going to impact women? Is it going to be some different impacts? And let's discuss that. And then I think, on a very kind of personal note, I do believe in the 21st century, that we can agree that cleaning and cooking, it's a basic life skill. It's not a gender role. So I think it's time for us to move on that and to support each other in that. And also, don't be afraid of resistance. As I was saying in the beginning, structural change, and that's what we're talking about, it will always cause some resistance. And when you are in doubt, I would finally say, turn to science. There's so much evidence out there, so many studies that would sort of underpin these arguments of why it is both right and smart to have more gender equality. So if you have a moment of, a depressive dip, then plow into some kind of big reports of wonderful statistics that is going to empower you and tell you that you are on the right path.
How about you? What's your advice to us Hungarians, not necessarily in government, not in corporate driving seats, and specifically, what's your advice to your fellow men?
That's a big question. No, I agree with everything that Katarina said there. I mean, I think there is definitely things we can do on a day-to-day basis that gets us into the mindset and culture of gender equality. Of course, it's about, the big issue, and as a man, I experience and I've been involved in our own department on the gender equality committee and looking at these issues. And it's really around work-life balance. It's really around, from a men's point of view, it's really around realizing the benefits and the joy of being more involved in your family, being more involved in the raising of your children, and not seeing that as a purely something that the mother has to do on a day-to-day basis. And one thing I really appreciate growing up is that my mother never did everything for me. She taught me very well how to look after myself, and as Katarina said, do the day-to-day jobs of ironing, cooking, washing, hoovering, everything like that. And I think that's instilling that into young boys, that this is also the responsibility growing up, and you can't expect others to do things for you, is really important from a young age. So I think that's a sort of a very basic day-to-day thing, but I think it's important in terms of educating your children that to get away from these gender stereotypes as much as possible. And of course, for men, it means that in the home, you need to show example. So my little boy, Nathan, or James, two little boys, are not going to learn how to do this unpaid work if they see that their father is not doing it. So if I'm sitting around at home and not doing anything, I'm not helping with the kids, they're going to learn from that example. And if my daughter Grace only sees my wife doing all the work, she thinks that's what she has to do as a woman. So it's that teaching that we can do every day as everyday people, and for our families, for people around us, for people at work, to make sure that when we're doing things that we always have that gender glasses on, that look into diversity all the time and leading by example in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you very much both to Katarina and Ronan. This was a very informative discussion. It would be great to have some kind of sort of top lessons learned as an excerpt from the conversation afterwards as well. Hope Egyenlítő will provide something like that for everyone to make use of and enjoy. And I'm now handing back to Esther for the remainder of the program.